Good morning, family. Sorry for taking that brief moment. I still get nervous sometimes. I gotta take a minute before I come up here. Um, so last week we talked about the roles of older men in the church. We hit on your responsibility to teach your wisdom to the younger generation, to teach what you know, to be an active participant and making sure that the younger people and that the women of the church we know what we're supposed to do, and now we're encouraged to continue doing it. We talked about the importance of doing these things with love in your hearts instead of anger or resentment. And today we're going to be talking to the older women. So for those of you that aren't older women, you still need to listen to this, because either you will one day be an older woman, or you need to listen to the part where it talks about how you're to treat older women. So if you remember last week, we were in Titus chapter 2 and 1 Timothy chapter 5. We're in the same chapters again this week. We're just going to keep going down the line. So in Titus chapter 2, verse 3, the scriptures read, "Older women likewise are to be reverent in behavior, not slanderers or slaves to much wine. They are to teach what is good." Now, typically you'd go into verse 4, right? I'm not going into verse 4 because verse 4 actually has more to do with the responsibilities of younger women than it does the older women. Okay, so there'll be a little segue next week when we get into that, talking about your responsibilities to that end. But I want to point out this first part of what we're reading here. It says, are to be reverent in behavior. And notice this says likewise, right? So that it indicates that that's expected of the older men. But this idea of being reverent in behavior, reverent means a deep and abiding respect. Okay. Now, typically we use the word reverent when used in conjunction with holiness. But that's not necessarily what it means. It actually has nothing to do with holiness. It's just a deep and abiding respect. You should feel that way towards God, but there are others you're called to show that to as well, right? So, because respect is also a word we don't often enough define and identify for others, we're going to talk a little bit about that today. I know we had a lesson several months ago on the idea of respect, but respect simply means to hold in high regard. All right, you guys remember when we talked about respecting one another and why that was important? Now, the things I have to say on this role are pretty limited because of my limited expertise with being a woman, specifically an older woman. All right. And I can't sit here. I can only make conjecture as to what makes this responsibility of yours so difficult, because it's not the role that I've been called to. So I've never experienced it, not in the way that you women have. Respect is something that's ultimately important, not just for the role that you've been called to, but for the role of those you're called to show it to. Okay, so let's look at some of the ideas of who you're called to respect. You know you're supposed to respect God, right? That you're reverent to God. We talked about this just a couple weeks ago when we talked about when you come to church, we're to be reverent. Our singing is reverent. Our praying is reverent. When we talk to one another, it's with reverence, right? This idea of everything we do has this underlying current of respect because of who we're talking to, who we're dealing with, who we've been called to be, and why we're allowed to be those people. But also, and this goes into next week's lesson a little bit, you're to be reverent towards your husbands. And we don't like using that word often in that context. We usually use the word respect, but as we just talked about, they're really pretty much the same thing. The thing is, and we've touched on this a couple of times since I've been with you in the last 9 months, your response to those in authority has more to do with enabling them to be in authority than it has to do with who you are. Now, that's not quite worded perfect. I couldn't really come up with the best way of saying that, so I'll explain it a little bit more. We talked a lot just last week about how much of a struggle it can be for, say, an elder to try to be an elder to a congregation when they won't listen, right? We talked about a supervisor at a workplace being completely ineffective as a supervisor if his workers don't do what he tells them to. Now, that authority carries over in all ways, right? So who's the head of the house? The man, right? The husband, the father, whatever that patriarchal form might be in that house. So who's the head of the church? Well, that's Jesus, right? Or in another way of saying it, God. So your reverence has more to do with their ability to be an authority in your life. You see, God has authority, but that authority means nothing if you don't respect that authority. Okay? You think of well, we'll just keep along the lines of some of the analogies I've been using. A boss at work, right? And you go into your job and you show no respect for your boss. You assume they don't know what they're talking about. You don't have to listen to them. Eventually, you're going to get fired. Like, nobody's going to deal with that for very long, right? But short term, the consequences are simply this. That workplace is not going to function properly because that boss, that supervisor, whatever they are, has been prevented from fulfilling their rightful role. We look at the idea of submission like it's giving up all power, like it's giving up, all of your desires, like what you think or what you feel doesn't matter. But submission is a role. And it has just as much power as the word leader. Because a leader is nothing if no one is following them. Interestingly enough, the world never can quite get this right. We actually have two euphemisms that we use pretty frequently. And they both are in direct contrast to one another. One of them is we tell kids, well, be a leader, not a follower, right? Don't do what other people do just because they're doing it. You do what you're supposed to do. You be a leader, right? But then we talk about how there's too many chiefs and not enough Indians. But to be fair, you've told every child in existence that they're supposed to be a leader and then complain that everyone's trying to be a leader. So, the fact is, there are some who are called to follow. In certain ways, we're all called to follow. The only differences between roles, and this gender roles, age roles, the only difference in roles is who we're called to follow. Women, you're to follow your husbands and your fathers, and you're to follow God. Men, you're to follow God so that you're somebody worth following. But here's the beauty, and I point this out whenever I have the opportunity because it's so important. That does not mean you get to say, I'm not submitting to you because you're not worthy of being followed. If your husband is the biggest fool you've ever met, which some of you will probably say that's the case. But if your husband is the biggest fool you've ever met, and he doesn't seem to get anything right, his life is a mess without you, right? There's nothing respectable about him. He won't get his affairs in order. You have to run everything if it's going to be run correctly. Guess what? It doesn't change what God tells you your responsibilities are. Now, this is doubly important for you older women because of what 1 Timothy chapter 5 says about older women and how we're to treat them. Verse 2 of chapter 5 says, older women as mothers, younger women as sisters, right? So if we start back at verse 1, we're talking about how to correct one another. Right, and so last week we looked at it telling us do not rebuke older men, but encourage them as you would a father figure. And then it goes on to say, then you're to encourage older women as you would a mother. Now we talked about this idea of family. We've talked about it over and over again. We're going to continue talking about it. But if family, right, those who share blood, and this will be a lesson here in the near future, the word relative. But if you're to treat older women in the church as mothers, then that means they're also supposed to serve as an example. Right? Because what is a father and mother's primary responsibility but to teach you your place and role and duty in life? And so older women, you actually come to church and you serve as an example for two different groups of people. You serve to the men as an example of what we're supposed to be looking for in a woman. Right? If you claim Christ, you claim to be a godly woman, then that means if I want a godly woman in my life, I should be able to look to you and see what that looks like. What should I be looking for in other women? And the women should be able to look to you and say, if I want to be a godly woman, if I want to be a Christian woman, this is what I'm supposed to look like, right? Emulate me as I seek to emulate Christ. You have to know your role in the church and in God's world and God's kingdom if you want to be able to show the respect to others that you've been called to show. But it's also important to understand what world others live in. You're not called to be nagging or henpecking. You're not called to be critical. You're not called to be boisterous and loud. You are called to be reverent, to show that ultimate example of what respect looks like. Moving on, it tells you not to be slanderers. Why? Well, for the same reason. You're an example. More importantly, if I am to treat all of you older women as I would a mother, then that means when you tell me something, it gets the same weight a mother would. That puts a lot of responsibility on your shoulders for how you talk about others. Because it would be so easy for you to come and say negative things to a younger man or a younger woman, and suddenly my view of that person has changed because of the respect I have for you. And you might simply be speaking in anger. It causes a lot of issues, actually, within people because your feelings change from week to week. And one week you might be really angry and upset at somebody and might say things you don't mean, except you went and told somebody that doesn't know that. And now their views have been changed over a longer period of time because they don't have that relationship with them. Slandering is probably one of the biggest contributing factors to disunity in God's church today. And it comes out in all kinds of different ways. We talked about gossip a few months back. And this is what we're talking about here, this idea of slandering, to come and say something against another person's character. And a lot of this is cured by one idea, by being able to look at somebody through God's eyes, through the eyes of eternity. It's difficult for me to say something against your character if I acknowledge that you and I are going to live in the same house for the rest of eternity. It's difficult for me to judge your character as less than when I acknowledge and recognize that we are in the same position, enslaved to the same master, with the same hopes and the same goals. Slandering caters to one specific sin, and that's pride. It's the idea that I am so lofty and so great and so perfect and so holy that I can speak ill to your character. I can point out all the flaws in who you are because I don't have those flaws. I am so thankful we have so many absolutely perfect people in the church, right? Here's the other thing slandering does, is it excludes people. And you'll find, I think that this is why this warning was given specifically to older women, because you will find that the struggle to include more people in a women's group is usually more difficult than it is for men. Men are easy. We're easy. You want to come to Bible study? Come to Bible study. Be respectful, right? Eat the food. Tell us we did a good job making it. We're happy, right? And if you can be knowledgeable about whatever subject we're talking about, well, you've got an in. We're a lot easier to please. We're not really overly interested most of the time. Now, most of the time, preachers are the exception. We're pretty bad about slandering sometimes. Gossip is kind of our bread and butter. So I tell you that because women are not the only people who struggle with it. But the idea of slandering is primarily something that comes about, you'll find a lot with women. How many of you think this is sounding pretty sexist of me up here? Okay. At the end of the day, I can point to scripture and tell you the apostles said this is who struggles with these problems. So it's not about me being sexist. I don't think one sex is better than another. I think we're all bound to the same place one way or the other. But I will acknowledge that men and women are different. Something the world doesn't like to talk about very often anymore. The struggles we have are different. Why? Because we are not the same. The roles we fill are not the same. The responsibilities we have are not the same. So of course we're not going to be the same. The next one is this idea of being slaves to much wine. Now, I'm not going to sit and pretend to know why they decided that that was something that needed to be specified for older women and not everyone else. But I will point out something that I have found in life that may help a little bit. With age comes wisdom. That's what we often tell people, right? And yet that's quite often not true. I have met some young people that have really, really gained an understanding of life and the world around them in ways most older women will never, or most older people will never be able to do. And I've met some older people that are pretty foolish. sometimes when our perceptions and our outlooks and our worldviews are not in line with what is true and correct, age brings resentment. Because the fact is, we are in spiritual warfare whether you choose to participate in it or not. That war is waging on, and whether you choose to arm up for the battle or not does not change the fact that you're in the battle. And you were not created for the purpose of going into war with the enemy without being armed. That is a weight no one was ever intended to carry. Without God, without Jesus, without faith, you will find that life brings only resentment because of those struggles. Because the world is an extremely disappointing place. Without those things, we find that the disappointment we face in life takes a huge toll on us. And I think that that's why this was pointed out to older women. And in other areas, it's spoken about not to be given to much wine. And it's always usually either somebody in a leadership role that's been warned about it, or it's older people. And I think it has something to do with this idea of us younger people. We still have lived few enough years that resentment has not built up in us. I think the answer to this ultimately is, just as we talked about before, this idea of an eternal focus. Being able to look at the world through the eyes of an eternal being, right, which you are. You are going to exist forever, right? You get to choose where you exist, but you will exist forever. Looking at life through that lens helps with this issue as well, because that resentment holds a lot less power in the scope of that long of a period of time. And when you hold on to the hope of heaven, as you do, if you're a Christian, if you call upon Christ as your master and Lord, then that means you're hoping, you're looking forward to, you're waiting with expectation on heaven. Then the suffering, the disappointments of this world are not really all that powerful. Older women, you've been given a responsibility and a duty in the church that sometimes is overlooked, oftentimes by foolish men, but just as equally often by women. The role of submission is not about you sitting down and shutting up and not doing anything. It's not even about us saying, well, you can teach the kids, and that's about all we got for you. It's not about, well, we can have you be a secretary or we can have you send cards, but that's really all we got for you. Your role, when you're being called to be submissive, your role is so much more powerful than being relegated to a back seat where no one looks at you. You've been called to be submissive because everyone is looking at you. So challenge you guys today to look at your life, look at your behavior, especially when we come together, and ask yourselves, have you lived up to that standard? Do you attend with reverence? When you go home, do you speak to your husbands reverently? But sometimes that familiarity that comes with living with a person can make that really difficult. But do you realize how much more difficult the responsibility of being a head of house and a man of God would be if the people who are supposed to be following us are disrespectful all the time? You imagine how impossible of a job that makes it? Now, most of you older women that this is talking to, most of you have been mothers, right? Have raised kids. What was easier? When they did what they were told? Or was it easier when they did what they wanted and ignored you? Now, understand, I'm not saying your husbands are your fathers, but I will say he's called to lead you, just like you were called to lead them. All of these roles come together, right? It's parts of a body, and we'll also be having a lesson pretty soon on the parts of a body as it applies to spiritual gifts. But this idea of parts of a body means that we have to fulfill our part so that the body can serve its function. And I'm not talking about the church at this point, I'm talking about our homes as well. Because the body serves no purpose without a head. I got into a conversation with a woman not too long ago where we're talking to her about this same concept, right? Her husband is the head of the house. And she said, well, but the neck tells the head where to turn. I'm like, okay, well, if you want to bring biology into it, the neck only turns where the head tells it to turn it. So we're still back at square one. And the thing is I've met a lot of people that will use this kind of reasoning. And what they're doing is they're making light of a very serious subject. And we do it all the time. Who wears the pants in your relationship? Right? We ask people that all the time. And specifically, it's a very common joke among men. That shouldn't even, not only should that not be funny to us, it shouldn't even be a necessary question. Because the fact is, if I have to question who has the authority in my house, who has the leadership role in my house, who gets their way in my house, who has the last say in my house, then the fact is my answer is probably not going to come from this book. You shouldn't be proud of uprooting God's plan. There's nothing funny about taking something that God said is infinitely important. So important, in fact, that he actually says those who breaks it, he hates it when people break it. Hate is a word God uses very sparingly. But divorce, he hates that. So marriage is very clearly extremely important to God. So why do we make light of it? Why do we make a joke out of it? The church functions the way it's supposed to function, and then the church fulfills its purpose, and it can't work the other way around. If the church is not as effective as it should be, then we have to ask the question, who isn't fulfilling their duties and responsibilities? Now, understand, by asking that question, I am not blaming the women, okay? I'm asking the question because it's a valid question that we need to ask ourselves on a regular basis. And usually, it's everybody. Men need to be stepping up, need to be taking that leadership role, need to be taking the responsibilities of making sure that the gospel is being preached, that it's being taught, that the works that we are doing are in alignment with God's will. And women, if you are not reverent and submissive to those responsibilities of men, then those men have double the burden. Because now we have to try to lead people who don't want us leading. That's an impossible task. I want to take some moments to say some things on a completely different note. For those of you that have already understood all of this, that have already understood your role and your responsibility in the church and in the family unit, do you realize that there are times you are the only reason that it continues? I talked this morning about how difficult it makes a man's job when a woman isn't reverent or submissive. But have you ever actually stopped to think about how impossible our jobs would be if the women that were next to us and near us stopped being that way? I think back at the things I've witnessed in church in the last, we'll say, decade. It's been a little bit less than that, but pretty close to a decade now. Most of the groundwork, most of the encouraging that meant that I've gotten, most of the communication that gets made to me, both while I was in prison and while I was in school, has been from the women of this congregation. With a few exceptions. There were some men that very much made a point to staying in constant communication with me, and I appreciate that, but most of that came from women. And do you realize that without all of that extra encouragement, all of that extra words of affirmation, I wouldn't have continued. I wouldn't have continued to be a Christian. I certainly wouldn't have continued down the road to be a preacher. Your reverence and your submission has just as much power as a man who is gifted in leadership. It will either keep us going or stop us in our tracks. Don't waste your time wishing so much for somebody else's role that you relegate all of the power that comes with yours. Now we can ascertain from the start of verse 4, right, when it says, and so train the young women, that phrase right there means to give an example. By doing these things, younger women are going to be looking up to you and are going to understand what they're supposed to be doing. But it does mean that you have a responsibility not only just to live a good life and to follow the commands and to be an example, but your teaching should be active. We talked about last Wednesday how detrimental it has been to our families when mothers and fathers don't teach their sons and daughters about marriage. We don't train our children how to be married. And we say, well, I'm married and they live with us, so they'll understand what marriage looks like because of how I treat my wife or how I treat my husband. But we don't take time to actively teach them how to be husbands and wives. And as a result, we have found marriage in a very dire place in the last few decades. Divorce on the rise, the importance of it declining. Vast majority of men anymore have no desire to be married because the risk is high and the rewards are almost nothing. That's not God's plan. So, what do we do about this? Well, I think first, it's time for us to start looking at what our specific responsibilities are given to us in Scripture. And I think second, it's that we need to start teaching others about those responsibilities. We need to start talking about this amongst one another. And we need to be able to talk about it with each other when we're failing. Now that means that right? As far as 1 Timothy chapter 5 is concerned, if an older woman in the church is not being submissive or is not being respectful or not being reverent or what have you, it means that I don't take her to my office and start yelling at her and lecturing her, like say I would Rudy. It's okay. You can laugh at the jokes. If he's offended by it, he'll come and talk to me, I'm sure. But it does mean that I have a responsibility to encourage you to rightful behavior. What does that look like, right? Because I'm a big fan of practical application. So I'm going to take a moment and apply 1 Timothy chapter 5 to all of you that are not older women. How do you encourage older women to retake their responsibilities in the church? A lot of it comes down to asking them why it's not happening in the first place. I've learned something. Miraculously enough, I've learned something from marriage. My wife likes questions a lot more than she likes my statements. Usually, women will already know what they should be doing. I'll say the same thing about men. Men, you already know what you're supposed to be doing. So if they're not, the proper response, the way to encourage them instead of rebuking them, is to ask them why it's not happening. Instead of me taking Linda aside and saying, you need to read this, Miss Linda. It's Titus chapter 2 right here. Why you're not doing this? Why aren't you doing this? Now, who's going to respond to that? I'm liable to get slapped across the face for talking to an older woman like that. But I take the same person to say, apologize for using you, Miss Linda. You were just looking at me when I started talking. I take Miss Linda aside and say, Miss Linda, I noticed in Bible study you were getting angry and you were talking pretty short with us. And I was just wondering, what's standing in your way? Why are you having a hard time respecting my position as a teacher? Why are you having a hard time showing disrespect to the elders? Why are you having a hard time with this? Well, I've opened the door to healing at that point, right? I've actually opened a gateway and allowed her to see the path that she's supposed to be on, reminded her of it, and allowed her to speak her piece so that I can heal whatever wound is causing it. Because most people who aren't doing what they're supposed to be doing start down that path out of some kind of hurt. Very few people I've ever met rebel for the sake of rebelling, right? I'm not going to come to church and in my mind be like, I'm going to go to church and I'm going to see how many times I can interrupt Rudy as he's teaching today. I think that'd be funny. I think I'm just going to disagree with everything he says just for the sake of disagreement. Wouldn't that be fun? Nobody does that. It usually comes from some place of hurt. If we care about one another, then we allow people to express that hurt so that we can seek healing for them. It's the same thing with older men. How do you encourage older men? Well, first and foremost, by not telling them what to do, usually. It doesn't work very well. No 80-year-old wants to hear a 20-year-old telling him what he ought to be doing in life. So the struggle comes about how we approach one another. And this is something I've tried to explain several times, and I always struggle with how to word the concept. But how we address one another, it is not two-faced or wishy-washy or sitting on the fence or whatever other weird parable you want to use for it. It's not negative for you to treat individuals differently. Each person is different and needs to be treated in accordance with what they need. And what that means is some of you will respond to me pointing out a verse and saying this is required of you, and that's enough. You say, all right, well, if that's what the Word of God says, then let me go fix this. And some of you need several lessons. Some of you will need me to make demands of you and say, this is what God says. This is what you're doing. What do we got to do to get you from here to there? And some of you need a lighter touch. You need somebody to come in and find those hurts in your life, the things that are negatively impacting you, to offer you a chance to heal those wounds. We all need different things. Why? Because the church is a hospital designed for the broken and the wounded and the sick. You didn't come here because you're okay. If you were, you wouldn't need Jesus in the first place. Stop demanding that everyone be healthy. And recognize that in others. When we talk to one another, when we're correcting the behavior of somebody, we need to treat them as somebody with the same illnesses everyone else has. Compassion is important. To that end, I will say something that's not specifically in our text, but I think is applicable anyways, to you women. You are really good, most of the time, really good at showing compassion to the people you don't know for the shortcomings in life. Most older women I've met, I can take them out and I can show them a homeless person. Compassion to the ends of the earth. Let's help them. Let's get them fed. Let's get them some clothes. Let's get them a place to stay, right? Most of those same women really struggle with the same levels of compassion when it's somebody they know. Because you see all of the flaws. And you see that guy that was homeless that comes to church every week, well, he's homeless because of the drugs he did, or because of the decisions that he made, or because he's just not as motivated or not ambitious enough. You see, we make up stories in our heads for the people we don't know. Bring that same level of compassion home with you. And I don't mean home to the place you go to sleep. I mean here, home, among your family. Because if we're to treat you as mothers, we should be able to expect some kind of motherly figure out of your character. Older women, the rest of us look to you for that spiritual nourishment. We might look to the men for the lessons, right? They tell us why this works, how this works. This is what God says. But our spiritual nourishment oftentimes comes from the women who are holding all of this in reverence. That's an important role. And this church gets a whole lot sicker without it. Interestingly enough, 5 years I've been preaching, worked at, I think I'm up to 17 different churches I've preached at in 5 years. I understand it's not me taking jobs and quitting or getting fired. I just preached at a lot of different churches when I was at school. I have preached at 3 churches that were exclusively women. I have never found a church that was exclusively men. It's not by choice, but those churches that were exclusively women were usually made up of widows and women whose husbands didn't care much for what we were doing. And I gave you some statistics a couple weeks ago, and I talked about how 33% of people, of faithful churchgoers, will say that they got all of their faith from their mothers. 33%. That's a pretty high number. Now, I use that lesson to talk about the responsibility that us fathers have on our children, but it should add a responsibility to the women of the church. Ultimately, I'll tell you this, if you, after 20, 30, 40 years in the congregation, haven't been able to figure out how to be these things for your congregation, but do you really have much of a right to demand that from the younger people? We'll do a summary statement here because next week we're moving on to the younger people of the congregation. So men, women, older people of the congregation, those whose children are of marriable age, right? Because that is traditionally what would have been called an older woman or an older man, right? So older men, older women, do you feel like you're an example in the church worth looking up to? Can you say, emulate me as I seek to emulate Christ? Can you make that statement in all honesty? When you look at your relationship with holiness, with Jesus, can you honestly say that you're in a place where the younger people should be looking to you for an example? Because that's where you got to get to. The Bible's complete. We know that, right? And then we know that all Scripture is good for the teaching and reproofing of the saints. But seeing Christianity in practice is just as important as knowing what Christianity is on paper. The Bible is complete because it doesn't tell us that we don't need anything else. It actually tells us that we have to have other believers. As a younger man, I have to have older men and older women to understand what this is all supposed to look like and then what my part in it is. You have a pivotal role in the continuing faith of all of those who come after you. So are you evangelizing? Do you preach the gospel? I don't mean preach from the pulpit, all right? Before anyone gets mad about me talking about women's roles, I'm not talking about preaching from the pulpit. But do you go out and proclaim the gospel to those who would hear it? Why do you expect it from us younger people? Because you did it once? Is that the example you want to set? That I go out and I proclaim the gospel for the first 20 years of my Christianity and then I'm done? Is that really what we want to teach people? Is it I respect my husband in public, but I don't have to respect him in private? Is that the example that you want to give to people? Because to be quite honest, no one is very good at hiding what they do in private. If you're disrespectful to your husband at home, it usually comes out in public. What's the example you want to set? What do you want the church to look like tomorrow? Because I want to encourage you to take that vision, that view, and work towards that today. Don't ask the next generation to do it for you. Sometimes in the church, we can get so wrapped up in leaving better, younger people for the church, and we don't realize that we have placed the church in a state where it's no longer desirable for the younger people. And we're not talking about making it a circus with lights and shows and events and things like that. I mean, when I come through these doors, I should be able to tell that you've been baptized, that you have been a follower of Christ by how you behave. And if I'm not receiving those things, I'm not going to be interested in sticking around. You want the younger people to start proclaiming the gospel, to spread the good news, to help grow God's kingdom and God's church? You got to start showing them how to do it. Don't talk about what happened 40 years ago when you were doing it. Do it now. Because the people here now, they don't know what it looks like anymore. The older people, your example is what allows the younger people to fill their roles. And for those of you that are here today, for those of you who are visiting, I want to thank you for coming. I want to encourage you, please come back. In the next couple of weeks, we're going to be talking about younger people in the church and their roles and their responsibilities. We're going to tie all of this together within the next 2 weeks. Right? And ideally, what I would like to get to is a better picture of how the church operates as a unit, as a body, as a family. I hope through all of this, we can gain a better appreciation for one another, a better respect for one another, and that we can be more effective. We can be more effective at teaching people the gospel. We can be more effective at doing God's work in the world around us, that we can be more effective at glorifying the Father. We'll take a moment to offer the services that Jesus Christ's sacrifice has provided. The opportunity to learn a different way of living, to heal yourself of all your sickness, of all your wounds, of all your hurts, your traumas, to accept a new place in life, a new responsibility, a new role, to have a place to call home, to have people to call family, to have a goal and a hope and a future. I want to take a moment to offer you eternity. I'm not a salesperson. I was never very good at it. Tried it several times. It's pretty unbelievable to me that I get to stand up here and offer you something like that. But I can tell you that we have found it. A way to gain eternal life is being offered to you today. So if you have any needs, if you'd like to come up and make confession, to seek reconciliation, perhaps you'd like to ask for prayers from your fellow saints, or if you're eager and ready for the waters of baptism to be put to death, the old you, to be raised up a new creation with a new purpose and a new hope. Whatever your needs are this morning, we invite you to bring them forward and make them known so that we can help you see them met as we stand and sing.